Most Canadians recognize that the living conditions on many First Nations reserves is not good. But what can we do about this, and how does it relate to the perspectives of Aboriginal peoples in relation to what it means to be a Canadian? In this video, we're going to look at some of the historical and modern issues that relate to the Aboriginal perspective on Canadian identity. Remember, in a previous unit, we talked about the issue of land claims. That is an essential part of the equation, but today we're going to look at other aspects. When Canada was colonized by the French and the English, First Nations groups had strong national identities. The treaties that we signed were in part a symbol of the respect we had for those nations' sovereignty. In 1969, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau and his Minister of Indian Affairs, Jean Chrétien, who would later become a Prime Minister, took a look at the living conditions for all Aboriginal peoples and felt that one of the key factors that was causing many of the problems was the Indian Act. They recognized that this law was keeping the First Nations people separate from the rest of Canada, and in order to create a just society in Canada, this separation needed to be eliminated. They stated in their white paper, which is a government proposal, the removal of the Indian Act would enable the Indian people to be free to develop Indian cultures in an environment of legal, social, and economic equality with other Canadians. Reserves would be converted into private land, and there'd be funding provided to help establish economic opportunities. The hope was that this would take a marginalized group and create a new status of Citizen Plus. But it's not so simple. The Indian Act, in part, protects the rights of Aboriginal peoples that are in the treaties. Remember, those treaties were signed in order to honor the expectations laid out in the Royal Proclamation of 1763, that the First Nations people were sovereign, and as such we must sign treaties with them to gain access to the land. Those treaties didn't have an expiration date, so to have the government in 1969 suddenly declare that the rights in those treaties would be null and void came as a shock. Aboriginal people saw the white paper as yet another attempt by the Canadian government to assimilate them, instead of trying to address the reasons for the second-class status of Aboriginal peoples. In 1970, the Indian Association of Alberta, under Harold Cardinal's leadership, rejected the white paper in their document, which became popularly known as the Red Paper. Citizens Plus was soon adopted as the national Indian stance on the white paper. Quoting the document, Aboriginal organizations across Canada agreed, "There is nothing more important than our treaties, our lands, and the well-being of our future generations." This event, long before you were born, was the catalyst to creating organizations such as the Assembly of First Nations. Aboriginal groups across Canada began to work together to protect their rights, their heritage, and their culture. They supported each other in affirming their national identities. And now, universities across Canada, both Native and non-Native Canadians, can study various Aboriginal groups. These organizations also work to ensure that the 1982 Constitution is respected, as the Constitution states that Aboriginal rights are considered among the highest laws of the land and can override other Canadian laws. This helps to reaffirm the First Nations and other Aboriginal identities. In the 1990s and 2000s, the Canadian government apologized for many of the negative impacts of European settlement, including a formal apology for residential schools. But apologies don't make the past just disappear. The Canadian government has also provided funds for therapy as well as cultural revitalization to help override some of those negative consequences, but the memories will still be a part of Aboriginal identity. And while a lot of Canadians don't want to admit it, there is a higher level of racism against Aboriginal peoples. Statistics prove it. If a Native young man and a non-Native young man are arrested for the same crime, the Native man will usually get a harsher penalty. Native people are more likely to be followed by security and less likely to be hired. In a sociology class I took in university, one of our assignments was to come to class with a racist joke. The intent of the assignment was to show how often the same joke is told with just a different marginalized group as the protagonist. So the same joke would have a Newfie or a Polish person, an Arab or a black man. But the other thing that I noticed was that the majority of the jokes in that lesson had a Native person as the protagonist. They were the idiot, they were the alcoholic. And from all that you've learned about Aboriginal history as well as modern living conditions, from the Métis having to fight for their rights, to the attempted assimilation through residential schools, to continuing land claims disputes, can you understand why some Aboriginal people may not feel the same way you do about being a Canadian? Some may not see July 1st as a great day to celebrate living in Canada. Images such as this are an expression of that different perspective. Again, I don't want to lump all Aboriginal people together. I know many Aboriginal people who are immensely proud to be Canadian, but some of those same people also have a feeling of ambivalence. They love Canada, but they don't always love what Canada has done and is doing to their people. And many non-Native Canadians may watch the news and not understand why things haven't gotten better since the 1969 White Paper or the 1996 Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, both of which explored how to solve the disparity and alienation of our Native peoples. But if those Canadians who are not Aboriginal can learn more by putting ourselves in their shoes, maybe all Canadians can have some empathy for the reactions to new government proposals. So when we discuss the idea of a unified Canadian identity, how do First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples fit in that definition? Or an even better question would be, what is the definition of a Canadian for Aboriginal peoples?